right, let's get started. How long ago were you diagnosed?
Actually, the diagnosis was completed last week. So
Oh,
I was,
so there's the
yeah, I was,
self-diagnosis and then there's the official diagnosis.
no, yeah, but what happened was I was diagnosed by a psychologist. I went to a psychology practice and I was diagnosed. But in Australia, you have to see a psychiatrist to confirm the diagnosis. So I only got the completion of that this last week. Since
Wow.
April.
Okay, awesome. And so what was happening in your own life? Because I will talk about your kids a little bit in later, but I want to hear from you what was happening. What were some of the things that you started to relate to around ADHD where you started to think, hey, maybe I should look into this?
Well, I suppose the fact that, I've always compared myself. I've got four kids, but there's two that I always compared myself to. I thought they were very similar to me. So there was that. But when they were diagnosed last year, the ADHD coach that we took them to said to me, you do realize the fact that two of your kids have ADHD means one of you has it. And I was absolutely convinced it was my husband. And I went home and I said, it's you. And he's like, no, it's you. And we asked the kids said, of course it's you, mom. And, I was like, what's going on? So I started thinking, okay, maybe I need to look into this. So I stopped and started to reflect. And I realized, okay, I am the one who loses my keys all the time with having to pay for dishonor fees and all these things. Like I started to actually reflect on it and I thought, maybe it's time I go and actually get myself assessed. So I did.
Were there any other things that you really related to other than losing your keys?
Oh, yeah, there's lots. There's lots. I mean, after listening to, ADHD podcasts, yours included, I kind of started to pick up a few things. So, um, for one, I've always found it overwhelming to just do basic tasks, like just things like cooking, things like going to the shops and doing shopping, following up on my youngest child, she's 5, and doing like a school uh, assignments, or all those things that parents are meant to do. I never knew what was due when. Like I had the information, but I was always surprised. I was like, oh, it's book week? Okay. Oh, we're supposed to bring this. So there was always, moments like that. And just also the inability to focus. A few years ago, I was working in a group practice and I used to put a sticky note on my laptop and I would say to my colleagues, I need the sticky note to focus. And they would say things like, yeah, it's because you got ADHD. And I said, yeah, I've got ADHD. And we'd joke around about the whole thing. And then when I did get diagnosed and I told them, I'd left that practice by then. When I told them, they were like, yeah, of course we told you. I said, but I thought we were all joking. They said, no, we were not joking. We were serious. So that was really interesting. Yeah, just over the years, I've always kind of had moments where I thought like something just didn't quite click for me. I always felt slower than other people. Like I was very capable. I was doing all these things, professionally, and I was a parent, but I just couldn't get on top of things. Um, Also, we had a bit of conflict with my husband because he was always thinking, "What's going on? Why is the house a mess?" And I'm like, "I don't know. I cleaned. I'm working on it." But what would happen is I would start something in one room and then I'll leave it to go and check out another room. And I get there, I see something else that needs to be done, and I'll start that. And before you know it, I've started three different projects in three different rooms. And then I look at the time, I think, oh, it's time to go pick up the kids. So you have all these things that are half done. And yeah, so that was frustrating. But the biggest, I think, challenge was always finances. I could never work out why I was getting so many the honor fee, because I was forgetting to pay bills, and I'll try and set up, direct debits, and then I'll do this. But I was still struggling even then because then I'll forget something, then I'll have to transfer money from this account to that account, and it just didn't make sense to me why all of that was happening because I was thinking, hey, switched on. So why am I not able to get on top of, finances and all of that? And in terms of other things, I always called myself a lazy eater. Like I could just survive on bread and slice of toast and tea. Like why that the thought of having to just prepare, but I had to discipline myself, to actually prepare a meal. But yeah, things like that that other people I think would just take for granted, you know. Um, yeah. So I started thinking about all those things.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting when you talk about sort of joking about it, because I feel like I had a similar experience with my therapist, or, just that feeling like she would talk about it. She would say, like, you should look into it. I think you have ADHD. And I would say, yeah, maybe. Like, it didn't really like land with me in a way that it did after COVID and lockdown. Um,
Mm,
when I think it was that connection between some of these behaviors that were very common. I had everything you talked about. I shared, right? The bounce checks, not understanding how I forgot things, forgetting all the things with
mm,
school, but like always realizing that with every one of those behaviors came that shame, right? That terrible feeling of like, what's wrong with me? And how much that I never made that connection that maybe all of that was ADHD. And that's why I was ending up in this depressed state all the time, because I would often, I
mm,
know I've talked about this on the podcast too, that feeling of like, why am I so depressed? I have a great life. I have great kids. I have a great family. I have a wonderful husband, a supportive husband. Like, why am I insisting on being depressed? And it was so I think it was
yeah,
like that realization that there's such there's such self-blame. It's always about like the me problem versus, oh, you mean there's a name for this? This is a
yeah,
a neurological issue. It's so
yeah.
enlightening. And that's why it's such a relief when we get that diagnosis.
Exactly. And I think for me, the thing that stood out the most was just the fact that I've got so many unfinished projects. Like I I get a lot of ideas. I get all these brilliant ideas. I think they're brilliant. And then I go on a mission. I'm like, this is it. I'm gonna do this and it's gonna change the world and it's gonna do all sorts of things. And then before long, something else pops up that's very exciting to do. So I leave that one and I go start another one. And so I started to observe that, "Oh, actually I've done that for many years. I've got a few online courses that are waiting for me to attend to, you know, just things. I've got books unfinished. It took me 5 years to write a 30-page book. Like that's how bad it got. And I'm currently working on one that I was supposed to finish last September. I don't know when I'll finish it. It's ridiculous when you think about it. Like I'm thinking, okay, when I start the project, I can predict that this should take 6 months or maybe a year. But 5 years later, I'm still writing the same book. So after the diagnosis, I started being more aware of, the things I say. I'm very careful now. I don't just say anything. I don't just tell people this is, what I'm going to do. Another thing was multiple handbags. I've got so many handbags. Some people are into shoes, but the interesting thing about my handbags is that it's the same version of the handbag or backpacks. I think I once had like 3 or 4 black backpacks because the one I bought previously just didn't quite do it. But at the time when I bought it, I thought this is it. This is the bag that's going to solve all my problems. And then next time I see another one, I'm like, I think actually this one works better because that one that I bought doesn't have this particular pocket, which I need for that particular thing. Yeah, so I started realizing that I've got all these bags. And what's funny is one of my daughters, she's not, we haven't taken her for an assessment yet. She's got like 7 versions of the same lip gloss. Like it's the same clear lip gloss, 7 or multiple uh, perfumes. And I'm thinking, I recognize this behavior. It's me.
Right? That's really interesting. That idea of like always searching for the right fit, because that is so relatable in terms of a lot of things, right? I have the same thing with purses. And yet I was when you were talking, I had there's this wallet that I bought when I was very young, and I love it. It was the perfect wallet. It was great. And I remember one year for Christmas, my husband bought me a new wallet, and I got so mad at him. I was yelling at him because I was like, "What makes you think I need like I like it's not like I like wallets. I just want this wallet." And he couldn't understand why I was so upset with him, but I think it was that feeling of like how important it is to get that right fit. But I
Mm.
was also thinking about how I lose important cards because I'm constantly moving things. I'll lose like important bus passes or credit cards and or ID because I'm moving it always from one wallet and handbag to another.
Ended up on Interpol last year because I lost our passports. And then I found them. Then I forgot to report that I found them. I showed up at the airport. Oh, this is just crazy. I showed up at the airport in South Africa to come back to Australia, and they're like, "Do you have another passport?" And I said, "No, this one is fairly new. I don't have any." They're like, "Did you ever lose your passport?" I said, "Yeah, I lost it in December, but I found it. Did you tell anyone that you found it?" I was like, "No, I didn't." And they're like, "Well, you're on the Interpol list. You can't travel." I was like, "No way." So I had to go back to Botswana, which is where I'm from, and the rest of the family went to Australia, while my 5-year-old and I flew back to Botswana because I lost the passport. Then we got it all sorted out eventually, you know. And then when we came back, the next morning we were leaving to go to Australia, but that evening, the night before, I'm packing everything, and I'm like, "Where are the passports?" This is the second time around, mine and my 5-year-old, and I can't find the passport. And all I could think about was my husband and how stressful it had been for him, for me to tell him, "Lost the passports, found them, got back," you know. So I'm thinking, how do I tell him I've lost the passports again? So I called the Uber driver, that had brought us through, was saying, the next morning, I'm leaving a few hours later. And I called him, and he said, "Okay, I'll check. Just to still McDonald's, I'll check whether they're in the car." So he calls me back and he says, "Yep, they're here in the seat, in the Uber." And he brought them to me. Luckily, it was the same. We tend to hire the same Uber driver. So that was really cool. So he came and he brought the passports, and, I'd love to say the problem was solved, but because, yeah, we got to the passports and we were like, "Yeah, we're here, ready to go." They're like, "Have you got another passport?" I'm like, "This is not happening again." I was like, "No, I don't have another passport." And they're like, "You're on an Interpol." I said, "I just had this experience a week ago, and I went back to Botswana, and I'm back again." And everybody's getting ready to go on board, and I'm sitting here thinking, this is not happening.
Oh,
Anyway, eventually, they were able to sort it out. They contacted a few people. It just looked like somebody had not done their bit to kind of say, "Yep, you can release, take care of the thing." So yeah, that's it. But that's my life. There's always stuff like that happening,
mhm.
So
Oh, I
yes,
hear
so
you.
that's I think is crazy.
Now you had mentioned in our correspondence about, being from Botswana, what it's like to, have this, how is ADHD viewed in Southern Africa? How is it something that you've talked about with your extended family?
No, that's the thing. You see, I came to Australia when I was 18, going on 19. So I've spent most of my, I guess, adult life here. I do go back home often, and I'm in contact with family, but we don't really talk much about ADHD, although I have to say there is probably about two family members that have got ADHD, but it's always been spoken about just in the background. It's not really something that, was ever a thing. Like, me being diagnosed has been the shock of my life. And I've only told my mom and my aunt and maybe two cousins. So probably about 4 people know about it,
Mm.
and my brother. So it's actually not something. Yeah.
This is your
This
coming
is the
out
biggest.
story.
This is me exactly. This is it. So yeah, nobody, yeah, my family doesn't really know. They don't really talk about it. I don't think people necessarily, yeah, people understand a lot of, different things that people deal with, but ADHD is not one of those things that's ever been spoken about.
Mhm.
It's all new, I think. We know about it exists, but it's all new. Certainly, my understanding of it since being diagnosed has really changed, even as a professional, you know.
Well, do you think that, having interviewed women from so many different countries, it feels like ADHD is a product of Western, you know, Protestant work ethic and capitalism in the way that it's much more difficult for a neurodivergent brain to exist in Western cultures, right? Because of the demands and the classroom environments, and it feels like there are cultures and countries where if you are neurodivergent and you have ADHD, it's not necessarily labeled as a disorder, right? It's not pathologized. And so I
Mm,
wonder, given your background too as a psychologist, like is do what are your thoughts about this pathologization of these behaviors, or these kind of thought patterns?
mm. Yeah, I certainly think, my view of ADHD has changed since being diagnosed. Um, because my experience of it was always through, clients that would come through, and it was usually young kids, that have got ADHD. And it was not necessarily for me to assess them because that's not my specialty. It was maybe just to work with them, help them with whether it's anxiety or whatever other comorbidities that may have been there. So it was never really a specialty of mine. But after the diagnosis, I really went into it. I hyper focused on the ADHD, everything you can think of, YouTube, podcasts, books, the whole lot, Um, and I came to understand that okay, it's definitely a different way, different brain, different way of thinking. That set well with me, uh, more than the idea that there's something wrong with you. Just yeah, simplicity. But from a cultural perspective, I think just with anything mental health, the culture generally doesn't highlight that there's something wrong with you. I think some do, but I think there's always this sense of it's community. Collectivist societies tend to just kind of embrace things more than I think individualistic societies. But of course, there are differences in families. So in my family, there was I mean, we've had different mental health um, issues. So something like ADHD wouldn't necessarily be viewed as a negative as such. I think it would be viewed more as okay, so this is different. Okay, this is another thing, maybe a different thing to work with, to deal with. So I feel like there's a bit more of an embracing, such that if you say to people, "I've got ADHD," it's like, "Oh, okay," and then they move on. There isn't really, you know, uh, people don't dwell on it
Yeah.
like
I
it's
I feel like the younger generation is like that as well. I feel like a very hopeful for the next generation, our children who talk about their mental health in a much more open way, right? So it's like, I have ADHD, and you're like, oh, that's nice. I have, you know, um, I'm left-handed. Like it's just one of those things that's offhand. There's no stigma there.
yeah. It's interesting, like thinking back to your question about what things made me think about ADHD. Time blindness is such a big thing for me. Like even before I was going to just getting ready for this interview, I was thinking, I need to go to the shops. Now, before the diagnosis, I would have gone to the shops. And I would have been in front of this laptop 2 minutes before and in panic mode and thinking, oh my goodness, where's this? But now that I'm aware, I don't do things like that. I actually stop and say, think about this. You don't actually have the time to do this. So I'm always that person who shows up like 5 minutes before something starts. My husband sometimes says to me, didn't you wake up at 5 a.m.? I'm like, yeah. So how is it that you were late in dropping the kids? I'm like, hey, stuff happens. I don't know. Something happens there. I could never explain it. when my kids were younger, I had the same problem. I'd wake up early hours. It didn't matter what time I woke up. I was still late, to the point that I remember driving up to one of my kids' schools and parking the car, and I was celebrating. And the kids were like, "Mom, what's going on?" I was so excited. What's going on? I was like, and I was giving myself a like it was such it was a funny thing for them to watch me just being excited that I actually got them to school on time before the bell went. So I used to experience that because I've got like three teenagers and then I've got a 5-year-old. So there's them back there and then there's this little one, and I'm noticing, oh, I'm having the same issues as I did back then. But
Mm.
back then I always blamed the kids. I was like, it's the kids. They go under the bed when they're supposed to be putting their clothes on, and you know but now I'm like, okay, maybe it's not just the kids. There must be something else going on there. You know, I'm that past parent who, like a few weeks ago, for a whole week, I was that parent who was, you know, parents were holding the gate open for me as I ran through the door because the bell had gone, ran through the gate. Like, it's like, so it was just a funny picture in my head that, oh my gosh, I am that parent, who's everybody's feeling sorry for her because she's just like, and my 5-year-old will say to me, Mom, we're not late. I'm like, I know. Today we're not late. And she gets excited with me and losing the car. She's like, Mom, you're always losing the car. I'm like, yeah, I know. She's like, you're forgettable. I'm like, yes, I'm forgettable. So cute.
Oh, kids. Gotta
Yeah,
love their honesty. But one of the things that I love about the honesty with children is that there is no judgment sometimes, right? When they're that young. And
yeah.
so it can be a real opportunity to reframe a lot of this stuff, right? It's like we're the ones who bring the judgment into that. And so how like
Mm,
that's one of the things I've noticed since my diagnosis. It's just how I talk about myself to my children has changed dramatically because it's like
yeah.
I know because both my kids have been diagnosed with ADHD since me. I had a sort of similar experience where I had my son was cut from the same cloth. I was like, if I have it, you definitely have it. But my daughter was not like me at all. And it wasn't until I was interviewing women and realizing, oh, this is also what ADHD looks like. So both
Mm,
of them have been diagnosed, but they're both very, very different. But I think one of the
yes.
things is, yeah, is just how, I feel like my role now as their mom is to uplift ADHD, to really talk about the strengths and to really have a sense of humor
Yes.
about the deficits. And and it's
Yeah,
hard
yeah,
sometimes,
yeah,
right? Because you're just like, oh,
yeah.
it can be tight. Like when you were talking about uh picking them up late, I do that all the time because I'm like, the worst thing for me is if I have 5 minutes to spare, because if I have 5 minutes to spare, I think I can do anything. And so there's been so many
Exactly.
times where I'm like, I've got 5 minutes. I'm going to just like sweep and mop the kitchen floor. I'm like, that doesn't take 5 minutes, but like, I don't know what everything in my mind takes 5 minutes. I've gotten into trouble so many times with that.
Yeah, exactly. It's so funny. The thing that surprised me though, about myself was this idea that I actually have sensory issues. I never thought I didn't know about sensory issues, let me say. But I started to look back. But I used to wonder why when I go to bed, I had to have pillows on my head. Like I had to have pillows on my head and only my nose would stick out so I could breathe. And have those pillows, and I don't like loud noise. And my husband likes to play his music loud, and I'm like, this is too much. And I used to think it was because I was a therapist, and I would say to him, I was like, look, in my work, it's very quiet and gentle. This is too much. That's why I can't stand the loud noise. And he would think I'm just, spoiling his life and, spoiling his vibe with not allowing him to have this loud music. So there's always that, bit of tension around that. But also just things like I can't drink cold water. I just cannot. I've always struggled with water. It has to be
Same.
hot water, not warm, hot water. Otherwise, I just can't do it. Um, and yeah, certain music just offends me. Like it offends my senses. I just can't stand it. So there's just a few things that but okay, maybe that's what it is. It's sensory issues.
That's so funny. I never
But
thought
that's been
about that, but
interesting.
I apologize to anybody out there who loves iced coffee, but I do not understand how anyone can drink iced coffee. It's the most disgusting thing in my mind. I love, and it's coffee is hot. But anyway,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, well, and I think also with parenting too, like you said, like when your kids are little, it's just chaos. And so I didn't know if this was just normal parenting, right? Like I was the same. I never would have said I had sensory issues, but I think for me, it was the noise and the movements and all of the chaos of young kids that I would suddenly go from being okay to yelling at them and not knowing where that
Yeah.
rage came from. And that was a huge light bulb moment for me too, was that, oh, this is a sensory
Yes.
thing. This is not, I'm a
Yeah.
horrible mom thing.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I noticed that in myself, like mornings, getting ready for the school run, and Sunday mornings are the worst. It's getting better, but Sunday mornings with church, oh my goodness! Like if there's gonna be any arguments in our house, it's Sunday morning. Because it's like you're trying to get people. Well, first of all, you gotta wake people up who should be waking themselves up, and then you gotta go wake them up again and again, and then you're trying to get yourself ready, and it's just chaos. And you're thinking, and in my role, I've got to go and do, let's say, some, not all the time, but I have to do the preaching. So on a Sunday when I'm supposed to be doing the preaching, you obviously have to prepare. You have to be in a certain headspace, so you don't need any conflict around you. So I try to communicate to the family that, guys, just for today, just for this one, let's just don't fight, kids. Just everybody get along. No, it does not happen. It's just as chaotic as any other. So I have to just breathe through it all. But yeah, I find it quite, overwhelming, and I just have to remove myself sometimes. And yeah, it's just funny.
Yeah.
Um,
Those
that
are those
overwhelm.
moments where I feel like knowledge is power, right? Because now you're sort of like, okay, so what I need is I need that time. I need that, I had a client once call it joints, right? Where it's like these joints of between transitioning from one environment to another, where you need that centering, you need that like exhale
Mm,
to, and
mm,
you don't get that a lot when your kids are young. And so it's like, where can I intentionally bring those moments of exhale back into my life?
once hid in the car. Like, I don't know how old my kids were, but I just went and hid in the floor of the car. And all I could hear was the kids saying, check the back of the house. And I was just lying flat in the car, not moving. So I was like, okay, that must have been overwhelmed. Like, why else would a grown woman go and hide from her 5 or 4 year old
No,
kids?
but we talk about that all the time of waiting in the car before you go into the house, right? Is another
Yeah,
joint,
yeah,
right? And I think a lot of us who are neurodivergent have that moment of like, I just got home. Let me just take a minute, take a beat before I go in. And I used to think like, am I a terrible mom because I'm not always running to go see my children all the time and I'm desperate, but it's like taking that moment of just like, okay, I just need that calm, that moment to myself to recharge, whatever it is.
mm,
Um,
mm,
yeah, it's funny because when I was a kid, we would go to church every morning and it was the same. And I never thought about this. But we would have those moments of like everybody in the car is fighting, and we would get to the parking lot of the church and we'd be like, okay, everybody smile. And I would always, as a kid, I would be like, this is so hypocritical. What are we doing? This is
mm.
awful. But really now, like as you were talking about it, I had this realization, this moment where I was like, no, these were my parents just giving themselves that moment, right? That joint. It wasn't necessarily hypocrisy because everybody is
Yeah.
all families fight, but it was like these moments
Mm,
that they needed to center themselves. And as a child, I
yeah.
was thinking like, we're living a lie. But no, I appreciate your
Yeah.
perspective because I feel like I just reframed that whole childhood experience for me. Um,
Oh, yeah. It's, yeah. I don't know. There's just so many things. There's a sadness, I think, about ADHD, really. Like, there's some really good things, but for me, when I think about now that I'm aware of it, I'm finding that I'm also aware of the impact. Just this decision paralysis is such a big thing for me. Like my my list, my to do list, just never ends. Every day I'm adding to it. Every day I'm thinking I'm making some progress, and I am, but I'm not making as much progress as I would like to. So you'd have like 20 tasks in front of you, and you're thinking, I don't even know where to start. Okay, that's it. I'm gonna go watch my favorite show. That's literally what happens. I sit there and I'm thinking, I've got 3 hours. 3 hours later, I come out and I've done 20 minutes worth of work because I went to do something and then something else popped up and I thought, that's really important. I should attend to that, and then I moved from that to that to that. I used to think for a while, because I wasn't aware of the ADHD, I would just used to think, I'm just busy. People would say to me, you're doing so much. It didn't feel like so much to me. It'd be like, because I've got all the multiple roles, right? So they're like, you're doing so much, you need to cut down. I was like, yeah, there's nothing to cut. Like I would like to cut, but I can't see where to cut. It felt like everything I was doing had to be done, but I just could never get on top of it. Never could. And the paperwork is the worst. Like, oh my goodness, like even now, the number of emails I'm yet to respond to, I'll be like, okay, I'll get back to that one and I'll get back to that. I'm constantly reorganizing my calendar, trying to find where to fit things in. And it's just like, I don't even know where it's almost like I create an extra hour for myself in the day, make myself have a 25-hour day, Yeah, so just that decision paralysis and this inability to get on top of things and just feeling like, I can't. And the rejection sensitivity as well. I didn't know I had that. I've always been a sensitive person, but I didn't have a name for that part of it. So that's been interesting to observe as well. I've always interesting thing at the moment at church we're doing a series on relationships and the message I did the message and it was on people pleasing, you know. So that was really interesting because when I preach, I talk about myself, the storyteller, and yeah, shared a bit about the people pleasing tendencies, and it's been interesting being able to look at it from the ADHD perspective. That need to make sure you fix so you haven't hurt people's feelings and the impact of all of that. So
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Well, and I think, that was one of those things that I started to look at, especially with my daughter, because I think she falls much more into that category of the raised as a girl, female who has perfectionism, anxiety, people pleasing, right? And when I started to look at those as trauma responses, really just, that hypervigilance, that feeling like I need to control how people see me, right? That a lot of us have that feeling of I'm tricking people, or, if there's some way that I can, make people like me, like develop our sense of worth from how we serve others and how complicated all of that is. But once I started seeing that, realizing that this was, a much more much more complicated qualities that so many of us, experience. So I'm curious, like, what am I trying to ask here? I think when you're talking about like the being more aware of the impact of some of these behaviors that you might have just dismissed before, but really seeing that like deep seated, that's what I think of. And even like with RSD, I always joke that everybody remembers where they were the first time they heard about rejection sensitive dysphoria because it hits you like a punch in the gut, in
Mm,
terms of just how much you didn't realize you were struggling, right? In some ways.
mm. Yeah, yeah, that's right. Um, Yeah, the emotional, the interesting thing for me actually, I recently worked with a health coach, and the reason I stopped working with him was he was brilliant. He was so good. I stopped working with him because the way he works is that every day he checks on me, which is really good. Like every day, voice note, text message, like it's really, really. But it came to a point where I actually had a conversation with him where I said, I think I would like us to reduce it so that we don't do it every day. Because I could tell that I was starting to put pressure on myself to make sure I was being a good student. And I told him that, he's very good at understanding of all of that. said, yeah, I'm sensing that that's what's going on here with me, and I'm struggling. Not that he was putting pressure on me, but I was putting pressure on him. But it just didn't mean too much. As in, it didn't matter what he said. It didn't matter that he was like, no, don't worry about it. It's not about that. It's not. Still, I felt the pressure. So I was like, okay, I need to kind of maybe step back from this process and see how it goes. So that was an interesting experience for me, because I didn't think I was like that. I thought I would be like, okay, I'm getting a coach, I'm going to do it. And I did end up saying to him, you know what, I realized that I wasn't ready for coaching in that context anymore. I realized I wasn't ready. Like, I've got all these goals. I know what to do. I want to do it. But coaching requires that you be in a specific headspace and ready to go. And I was finding I was just sabotaging myself. Like sabotage. I mean, I've struggled with obesity. We've got obesity on my father's side of the family, so I've struggled with weight issues all my life. And so the ADHD thing has also made me think about that as well. Like, okay, what of my eating behaviors are linked to, the impulsivity and the dopamine fix and all. So that's been another interesting thing
Yeah.
for me.
Well, and not only that, but eating beyond fullness, like just not being in charge, not being connected to our hunger and fullness cues because of interoception, which was a term I had never heard before until I was diagnosed with ADHD and started realizing, that idea of how we just a lot of the time are not paying attention to our body's cues, right? And, we bump into things. I don't know I have to go to the bathroom until I'm bursting. I don't know I have a headache until my husband asks me, "What's wrong? You look like you're really struggling." And I was like, "Oh, yeah, I guess I have a headache." Like all those moments where it's like we don't pay attention. We're so in our heads that we don't pay attention. And so it makes sense that it's like, I don't know I'm hungry until I'm starving. And then if I'm starving, I'm like you, I'm a lazy eater. I'm eating peanut butter with a spoon or eating an entire bag of chips or something, like the food stuff was mind blowing to me because, like, I worked with binge eaters too. So it was a lot, and I had been through diet culture. I was a former Weight Watchers leader. So as like, I definitely was a yo-yo dieter my whole life. And really, that was mind blowing to think about how ADHD influences not only that feeling of not knowing our hunger and fullness cues, but also that, like you were saying, like wanting to be the good student, right? Wanting to be perfect at everything, wanting to know exactly how much point something is and calories and weighing and being exact, and then burning yourself out and then saying, "Oh, screw it, I'm gonna I'm gonna eat the whole
Yeah,
freezer."
the
All of
black
those
and white
moments.
thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny when you talk about bumping into things because, oh my goodness. So at the moment, the psychiatrist they've given me the diagnosis, but they can't prescribe stimulants to me yet because they want me to see a neurologist. And the reason they want me to see a neurologist is because when they were assessing me, I mentioned that I've had so many falls over the years, most of them unexplained. That's what I say. I say they're unexplained. So, my husband was giving me a hard time about that. He's like, because he's keen on me getting the medication. So he was a bit disappointed that they put a pause on it. And he's like, why did you tell them the falls were unexplained? What fall is unexplained? Like, did you not trip or something? It's like, he's like, so did you just find yourself on the floor? I'm like, yeah, exactly. That's it. I find myself on the floor. I mean, if you trace it, you could probably find, but I really can't explain it in a way that makes sense to me. I just find I fall. So the psychiatrist was like, we need you to see a neurologist so they can check, if there's something else going on because we don't want to give you stimulants if it's gonna, cause seizures or anything like that.
Yeah. Oh,
So that was funny.
that's unexplained bruises, I think, is absolutely part of ADHD. And like this just happened to me recently where I'm back in school and our both of my classes this semester are tiny little desks with the attached little desk on the chair, right? Or tiny little chairs with this attached desk. And I had this huge bruise on my thigh, in the front of my thigh, and I had no idea where it came from. And my husband was like, "That's awful." Like it was really big. He was like, "Where did you get that bruise?" I was like, I have no idea. And then I went
Mm,
back to class the next week and realized what I had been doing was every time I sat in my chair and got out of the chair, I was hitting the desk over and over and over again with the same spot of my leg. And I was like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, that's where it's from. But it's like those moments where I'm like, no idea. And I was doing it over and over and over again. Anyway, um,
yeah,
it's
it's so
everywhere.
fun.
It really is. I mean, that's what I think is so mind-blowing about this diagnosis in adulthood. It's it's in every part of your life.
It is, and like I think I've had to really practice self-compassion, just reflecting on some things. Like, for example, my husband does most of, like, he's an accountant, so usually he does the money side of things, thank goodness. Because when I try and do it, I just mess it up. But he he puts the money in our account so I could sort out the kids' fees and everything. And I then forgot that I'd set up some direct debits around the same time. So somehow he put the money in the account, and whoever needed to take their money took their money. So I forgot about the fees. The following year, which was this year, we get an email from the school about the fees. So my husband calls me. He's like, "What's going on? What's this email about fees? I thought I put money in your account for that." And I had this moment where I'm like, I think there's an explanation for this, but I don't even know what it is, where to start, or whether to bother. Because you might just not get it. And you get had many moments like that where I'm like, I don't want to bother explaining because I don't think it's going to make sense to the person I'm trying to explain. It's going to seem like I'm making an excuse. So that's been kind of like the really challenging part where I've had to say, you know what, just be compassionate to yourself. This is bigger than you. This is just, ADHD is a big thing. It's the small things that people don't actually appreciate, and you can't really explain it to people unless, the person understands it.
Unless
So
you're
I've had to
talking to
just,
somebody else with ADHD, and then
yeah,
it's like, yeah,
exactly.
right? Oh my
They get
goodness.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. How long have you been married?
It's 20 years this year.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I
Yeah.
was,
And
go
yeah.
ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, my husband actually, after the diagnosis, he said to me, wow, it's like so many things make sense now. Like
Right?
he was actually like, oh my goodness. And he even said to me the other day, I don't know what we're talking about. He's like, look, still processing. Because I think I must have been asking him about why he's not saying something about something. He's like, I'm still processing this ADHD diagnosis as well, right? Because he's looking back at things, bills he's had to pay, tax office accounts he's had to clear, and all the stuff that has just like his reaction way back then was like, what's going on? Like, why are we not able to move forward? Thank goodness he's an accountant and he was able to make sure that, we were sorted that side of things. But if you had left it all up to me, yeah, it would have been disastrous. Not because I was always trying to explain to him, I'm not careless with money. It's just something I can't explain. It's just something that happens. And once I learned about executive, dysfunction, I was like, yeah, okay, that
Yeah.
makes sense. My brain is not able to just, yeah, put some things together.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. So, well, I think that's why I asked because I was like, if somebody's been with you that long, because my husband and I we're about to celebrate 21 years, and it's like the same, I'm like, he's been with me this long. Nothing is a surprise to him, right? But also realizing that that it is like there's this partnership that you're going through in terms of understanding,
Mm,
this was such a profound identity shift for me that obviously our relationship has shifted in a lot of ways. And it is, I appreciate that he has had to listen to me go on and on and on about my ADHD, but it's like you're developing
yeah,
this language, right? Like you said, you're both processing this
yeah.
awareness. And but this
Ah,
person knows you more than better than anyone else. And so I think, it's nice to have that um to be able to explain a lot of these behaviors, like you said.
he made me laugh because one day he doesn't like it when I use what he calls it psychology terms. I just think it's normal conversation, but he says I say these things. And one day I said, so we were having one of our family meetings, and I said, "Look, you guys, we are an ADHD household." He reacted. He's like, "What do you mean when don't say things like that?" But I was like, "We are." Like the kids have it, I have it. Like it was just too much for him. Like I had to back off a bit. I was like, okay, he's not ready for me to. Like, I was embracing it, like And the funny thing is, my husband and I, he's an introvert, I'm an extrovert, and you know, this oversharing thing, I never knew that that's what it was. I just thought, oh, that's just my personality, like I'll talk to everyone and I'll tell them everything. Like I'm just an open book. And my husband was the exact opposite. And he used to say, you have to tell everybody everything about your whole life. And I was thinking, why can't you tell anybody everything about your whole life? Like it didn't make sense to me that people had private lives. So, what
Oh
is
my
that?
goodness. I feel like we
So I
have
was
the
just
exact same marriage. Now, I want to just ask you too about, you're talking about self-compassion because a lot of this is, a lot of this is reframing for ourselves, but also, you're a woman of color who is a psychologist. You have, 4 children who are also of color who are going to be dealing with neurodivergence. How do you talk to them about advocating for themselves in school, in community, in society? Because, statistically, there is a lot more pressure, as you know, on people of color when it comes to, I don't know, what even is the word, behaving, right, in society. And how are you advocating? How are you talking about that with them, um, in terms of advocating for themselves?
Yeah, look, our kids are interesting in that number one, our household is very loud. Everyone in the house is loud and they've got their own opinion from the oldest to the youngest, right? And everybody thinks they're the funniest person in the house. Like it's just one of those households. So our kids are quite vocal. Generally speaking, anyway, they have their own opinions and they'll express them. We'll go backwards and forth. The interesting thing with our household is that my husband and I, obviously, are from Africa. Our kids were all born in Australia. So they're actually between cultures. So they come home and, yeah, we do the African thing. We're African, we do things African way. They go to school, things are done the Australian way. So it's just really interesting to just try and navigate that. And so when it comes to conversations about advocating for themselves, it's never really kind of been a conversation we've had in a big way, just because from since the kids were young, we've kind of always had these family meetings that we had up and down, and it's changed over the years, but once a week we have a family meeting, and in that family meeting, people get to voice their opinions. People get to talk about what's going on in their lives, and they try and express them. Some days have been better than others in terms of the conversations, but it kind of has created this environment where people can just talk about what is going on. So the ADHD thing has just kind of become just another thing that we talk about, not necessarily something out there that we focus on. It's just been kind of like, oh, so we've got ADHD in the household. So we just kind of treat it like any other thing, any other new thing to talk about.
Mhm.
So because they were all born here, I feel like they're more Australian than African, although they identify with both, but more so with the African. So they want to be seen as African, but in terms of how they are very much, from our perspective, Australian children. So sometimes they struggle. They're like, what are we? Are we African? Are we Australian? I'm like, you're African Australian. So that's what we say to them. That's what I say to them. So I think, yeah, there isn't anything that I can look at and say, okay, this has been a big, big problem that we need to actually go and exclusively advocate for this because of the fact that they're from a different culture. There's been those issues maybe in terms of them feeling like, okay, they're a minority, or issues to do with maybe their not being able to have their hair a certain way, and just small things that come up maybe at school with friends or people just saying maybe some every now and then some racist remarks, things like that. But the ADHD thing hasn't come up as an issue as such.
Mhm.
I think for my daughter, so my 14-year-old and my 19-year-old son are the ones who have the diagnosis. So my daughter has, yeah, they're both on medication, but I think she's adjusted it easier than my son. And what I mean is he's gotten to take the medication, but he hasn't necessarily been consistent with it. But that I feel like that's part of the ADHD,
Mhm.
him being not being consistent. Whereas with my daughter, she's been good with that, but I have to remind her. But of course, I forget. So that's been tricky as well. So I have to set an alarm to remind her. It's a whole mess.
I do the
It's just
same. I do the same with my teenage daughter. I have to, especially when it comes to remembering forms to sign and Mom, I told you 3 times. I'm like, did you?
yeah,
Anyway, um,
it's
but
so
it's,
bad.
one of the things that is so frustrating is, that when a white boy is misbehaving in class, the teacher will say, "Oh, he probably has ADHD. Let him get help." Right? But if it is a child, a girl or a girl who, a child of color, like they are sent to the principal's office, right? It's not, there's these expectations of children because of a lot of the just misunderstanding around ADHD that hopefully we are thankfully with podcasts and books and TikTok and everything else, we're breaking through a lot of those barriers. But I feel like I feel like there's just this added pressure that we don't talk about to be a good kid, right? And it's heightened,
Yeah.
um, depending on your intersectionality, and
Mm,
it's
mm,
unfortunate.
mm. Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
know. Take a deep sigh. Um,
I know. But
well, go ahead.
no, I'm thinking back to when I was younger, I was always an underperformer.
Mm,
As in, like, I always felt like there was more to me. It was just always a thought that there's more to me, but I'm not displaying the more. I feel like there's more, but I'm not, I'm just slow. I always felt slow in action. I was the one who would fight just simple things. I remember even at university, when I first came to Australia, I was like, how come I didn't know that everybody was buying a computer? Like small things like that. I was like, the government was, because we were government sponsored, and the government had, sorted out so that we could buy computers. This is part of what they were doing for us. But I didn't like information like that. It's something small. And I was like, why am I the last one to find out? It always felt like I was, the last one to find things out. And looking at my kids, if the two that I said are very similar, the ones that have been diagnosed, they're both very similar personalities, and they're also very laid back about life. And that's how I've always been. I don't rush, But now I recognize, maybe that's the ADHD, like maybe, even though there's the hyperactive side of it. But I was always just like this happy person, bubbly, talkative, no rush. Life is good, let's just overshare, let's enjoy life. But then underneath that, there was this sense of, I feel like I'm not moving. I'm not
mm,
progressing. I have all these goals. I have these, like, I've got goals. I've got things I want to achieve. There's this bigness that I see, but I don't see the evidence of it.
mm.
And because of the fact that I'm moving from one thing to another, pause, start in something else, pause. And then at the end, I'm like, oh, I've run out of time, you
Well,
know?
oh my goodness, that was so eloquent too. I feel like I just like deeply related to that. But one of the things I feel like I have to tell myself when it comes to all of the unfinished projects is that it's not finishing the project that is important to me. It's learning about the stuff that is important to me, right? It's the learning and not the finishing. And that's okay, right? Like there's not, it would be nice to have a finished
Mm.
product, but for me, I got what I wanted out of it and I moved on. And that's how I've kind of reframed it for me. And
But that's my problem. I never got what I wanted from it,
oh,
because
interesting.
what I wanted from
There's
it
always
was
more.
the final, like the things that I wasn't finishing with things, because my ideas, I'm always thinking, okay, I'm going to do this online course and then I'm going to sell it and I'm going to make money from it. I never made the money because I never finish. I get the idea, I start it, but I don't finish it. And then I come up with another one. That's the problem. So when it comes to just, I guess being an entrepreneur, if I can put it like that, it's like, what are these ideas of, okay, I could do this, I could do this, I could do this. And sometimes I have these conversations in my head. I'm like, oh, if people just knew these projects and how good they could be. It's all good in here. Implementing it, it's like, and I said to someone the other day, I was like, I've come to the realization that with the ideas that I have in my head, I actually need 20 people to assist me. That's the only way.
Coaching. This is why coaching is so wonderful for ADHD. As long as they don't text you every
Yes.
single day. I think that would
Yeah,
be,
that's why.
it's finding that right balance. But yeah, you're right. It's like having that thought partner, having that person who helps you get from A to B and all the steps in between. Yeah. Oh my goodness. I feel like we are living weirdly parallel lives. As I often do when I'm talking to women with ADHD. So I really appreciate you sharing your
Mm.
story. I've got so many more questions. I feel like we could go on for many more hours. But I'm curious, would you, if you could magically rename ADHD to something else, would you give it another name?
I thought about that question over and over, and the student in me was trying to come up with the perfect answer, and I couldn't. And I was like, so I came up with all sorts of things, but finally I came up with dysregulated attention and unsettled brain activity, and I call it the Uber.
I love it.
Dysregulated attention and unsettled brain activity. Yeah,
Unsettled brain activity. I like that because it's not pathologized, right? And so it's
yeah,
getting rid of the disorder part, but also talks about the unsettled brain is something I definitely would relate to because that's the other thing. I don't have one either. I always ask people because I don't have one, but I'm
yeah.
like, what would I have connected to, right? Because I never connected to that idea of ADHD before because I had this image of this little boy. And so I never connected to it. So I'm like, what would I have connected to as an adult? And I really like that dysregulated attention, unsettled brain
Yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah. Activity.
activity, right? Yeah.
But you know what? This wouldn't work as a name, but I think really, if I had to think about it, I would say they should have called it "It's Not Your Fault."
Oh, that's perfect.
I
There you
know, right?
go.
Yeah,
Oh,
because
I
there's
think
so
that
much
might be
that
my favorite.
happens. Yeah, there's so much that happens that, like you're saying, the shame and just that feeling of, oh my goodness, like what am I missing? There's all these gaps, you know. But yeah, it's not my fault, and that's what I found for myself. Like the diagnosis just brought the sense of, oh my goodness, it's okay to be me. Redefining what me is, and it's okay to be me, and it's not my fault. Like there's a reason. There's a reason why I did that or I didn't do that, and I can laugh about it, you know.
Oh,
But yeah,
I love that. Yeah, perfect. Right? Let's call it that. I think we should. INYF, the new name. It's not your fault.
it's not your fault.
Oh,
Oh gosh.
so gosh, so you are not only a pastor, but you also are a psychologist and a coach, right? So where can people find you if they want to work with you? Are you taking clients right now?
Yeah, so I have a website. Um, it's called hopelives.live.
Mhm.
So that's one way. I have an online Etsy store. It's called Hope Lives Treasures. as yourself, like digital products, and that's where I'm gonna put my online courses that I'm currently working on. Yeah, so my business is called Hope Lives Creations, and it's three pronged. It's really more about doing the clinical side of things, coaching for business, Christian women in business, and then there's the ebooks, the digital product side of things, publishing side of things. I'm very passionate about two subjects, and one is just helping women just use their God-given gifts, and just kind of rising up from wherever they are, bringing them up so that they can share themselves, share their gifts, but helping them, and that's where the Christian women side of it comes in. And then I'm passionate about obesity, so the online course I'm currently working on is it's called Shedding the Shame and Keeping It Off, Journey Through Weight Loss Challenges. And it's just really about, all the time we're talking about shedding weight, but I'm like, no, let's shed the shame first, because once you do that, everything else will fall into place. So that's like my big project that I'm really excited about at the
Oh,
moment.
why am I not surprised that you have five businesses? Um, right? I always like to joke, we don't have hobbies, we have side businesses. Um, oh, that's wonderful. Shedding the shame. I love it. And yeah, it really speaks to, I think, a lot of that weight, like you said, that we carry as women, as mothers, and as women with
Mm,
ADHD, especially. So beautiful. Well, I will have that
yeah.
in the show notes. Thank you so much, Unami, for sharing your story. And I guess everybody knows now, right?
It's out
This
there.
is it. It's out
It's out
there.
there.
But I don't call it oversharing anymore because I feel like there's no such thing as oversharing, as far as I'm
Exactly,
concerned.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think, your
If
vulnerability, the way you articulate some of these stories, I think a lot of listeners are really going to relate. And yeah, it's been a real pleasure meeting you and hearing your story. So thank you so much.
Thank you. No, thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time, and just yeah, it's great to. I love conversation. I love passion. I love being asked questions. I love to talk. So great combination. So I really appreciate you. Thank you.
I had what in being in school, I had one of my professors because I'm in school to be a therapist, and so one of my professors said, I'm really nosy. That's why I like being a therapist because I'm so nosy. And I was like, I felt so validated. I was like, oh, are we allowed to say that? Okay, because that's exactly why I have my podcast. It's why I was a journalist. It's why I want to be a therapist. I'm just nosy.
Yeah, actually, a funny thing that I know we gotta go, but the funny thing that's happened professionally for me is ever since my diagnosis, I've been able to identify more women who are my clients who actually have ADHD. Like I just doing the screening, like I'm a lot more aware. And so I'm doing more screening for that. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm seeing it. And even some of the clients that I've connected differently with, or they've always felt like there's just something about them, they all have ADHD.
Yeah.
So
I've
that's been interesting.
I noticed that too. I've said, and I've even said this to my professors too. I'm like, there is a frustration there that when clients come where if you're seeing their frustration in that they have a desire, but they're not able to follow through, that's not depression, that's frustration. And that is inherent in ADHD, right? It's not a lack of
Mm,
desire, it's an overwhelming desire, but the inability to follow through. And I'm like, if that is like, that should be that red flag, right? If you're seeing that level of frustration, the what's wrong with me, that's such a key indicator of
mm,
ADHD. And you see it, I see it everywhere now. And in my curriculum and my case studies and I'm like, oh my goodness, it's everywhere. um, but yeah,
yeah,
right.
exactly.
It's that frustration. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Okay.
Yeah,
Well, I was like, okay, we're going to start on another hour-long conversation. We can
I
be on
know
this
exactly,
road.
exactly. I was like, yeah,
Um,
there's a whole thing. Yeah.
well, thank you
Okay.
again. It's been so lovely to meet you, and yeah, I really
Yeah.
appreciate it.
thank you, and love your podcast. It's so beautiful. I love the way you interview and just give women opportunity to just share their heart. It's so freeing. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.